Okay. We can stop being quiet because we are live, at least Google says so. Welcome to the fourth Network Narratives Digital Alchemy studio visits, where we go and meet people and just converse about digital art. And this time we're talking about games, and we have a full house, which is really exciting this time. And we have no script, we have no plan, no one has written this game. And so it's going to be very emergent, which is a thing that Mia and I like to boast about, how emergent things are in NetNarr. But maybe there really is a script behind the scenes as we played this last year. I'm going to first ask some of our participants to introduce themselves. Just, give us your name, where you're from. And my question is, tell me the last game that you played most recently. So I will, I'm Alan Levine, by the way, and I have to eat my own dog food and do this first. I'm coming to you from my home in Arizona, and I just got back from a plane trip, and I always play the game 2048 on the plane while it lands and takes off. It just gives me something to do because it's not a good time to read or be on my computer. And so that's about one of the only games that I play. So I'll turn it over. We're going to go all the way down under to Alice Springs, to Wendy.
Good morning from Central Australia, Alice Springs. My name's Wendy, and I'm from the NetNarr Wild, which translates into being an open participant. And this is my second year running, and I'm still running. So the last game that I played, I think, was Memory, and that was I created it on H5P. So I've been having fun with that program because you can create sort of little games, and Memory's kind of fun just because you don't have to think too much, but then you sort of get to go, oh, yes, I got a pair. So that's me.
Excellent. And I see some beautiful art behind you, which we always like. We'll jump over to Norway. Boy, we're also all over the world in this one, and we'll say hello to Mia, which everybody knows Mia.
Hi, guys. So I'm Mia Zamora. I'm currently in Bergen, Norway, where I'm here for my sabbatical year. And I teach in the Department of Digital Culture. And the last game I played was not a formal game, but one that I made up on the spot with my kids when I was installing my soon-to-be launched art installation at the university library. We're having an event tomorrow where everyone will gather to see what I've created, but it involves a lot of string and the visualization, a sculpture of networks, digital networks, and the string and the yarn was being thrown back and forth between myself and my kids across the room and creating different vectors, etc. So a lot of times we just sort of gamify chores in a way that makes things more interesting. So I'm going to throw that out as the last game I played.
That definitely works, and definitely parenting is a game that you always have to invent on the spot, which is very appropriate to go over and introduce Mahabali from Cairo, Egypt. And so excited to see you in our hangout too, Maha.
Hi, so I'm Mahabali at the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and I'm teaching a course this semester which is about digital literacy and intercultural learning. And this month, my students are developing digital narrative games, which I hope that Alan and Mia's students will also give them feedback and talk to them and so on. The last game I played was Get Bad News that Alan shared with me yesterday. But then Mia just gave me an idea, and I just played this different game with my child today, trying to get her to do her math homework, which for some reason they give them homework when they're 6 over here. Where we had this, she has a new pencil, and we made all kinds of special things with the new pencil that will help her do the math faster. I kind of worked for a little bit of the day. But the other thing that's really on my mind is that my students are in the stage where they're thinking about what kind of games they want to develop. And there's one that I'm really excited about. I'm excited about all of them, actually. But the last one I read about is a student who's developing a game about what it means to be a single mother in Egypt because her mom raised her and her sister that way. And I love it when students want to develop a game based on their own personal experiences. Because it's very different to do something about something that you know really well than to try to empathize with another person and try to represent that. So I like that.
Very cool. And we'll talk some more about the games projects that your students are doing. We'll jump over back to Norway to Isabella, who is, I would guess, your student in Mia's class. Is that right?
Yes, I'm from Oslo in Norway, and I'm studying here in Bergen in Mia's course. And yeah, so far so good. Last game I played was actually today, where we had a lab and I made a rock, scissors, paper online. So that was my last game.
Very cool. It's great to have you. I wanted to mention, last week I was at a workshop with Reclaim Hosting, which a lot of you people know. And it was a 2-day workshop. We did a lot of technical stuff, but we had this thing during lunchtime where they had designed an escape room, which was just really brilliant, the way they did it. And probably the best part was when after you've done it, you got to watch the other people fumble around in there, and you're like, it's on the clock, it's on the clock. But enough of me babbling. 3 of my students from Kane are here, so we'll ask them to do the same intros. And so good to see you guys.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Haley.
I'm Marissa.
I'm Kelly.
We're writing studies grad students at Kane, students of Allen's. And the last game I played was Civilization 5 on Steam.
Oh. You're kind of hooked on that game, right?
I love that game. I have like, 100 hours logged? I don't know. I need it's some good time.
I have to go back to basics because the last game I played was Sims 3, and it was a couple weeks ago, and it's a classic and it's my favorite.
The last game I played was a word game on my phone. So yeah, that's about it.
All right. And so awesome to have you guys here. And now we'll ask Remi to introduce himself and say a little bit more about your interest in games.
Sure. So again, it's lovely to be here with everyone. My name is Remi Kalir. Let's see, the last game I played, I believe, was the game Dots. It's a very simple game where you make a dotted grid on a piece of paper and then begin to fill in little boxes. I played that with a young kid at a little gathering the other day, and which I suppose, in any case, awesome. I love the chat. Anyways, yeah, I've been designing and studying and playing games for a little while now. I guess I'll mention very briefly that when I was a high school student, I got roped into somebody's dissertation. He at the time was a technology designer and educational researcher and was looking at how a simulation of the conflict in the Middle East could provide a kind of game-based entry point to thinking about conflict resolution, debate, perspective taking, negotiation, communication breakdowns. And I got really engaged with that. And so ever since that experience, I've been really interested in the way in which we design game-based and kind of play-based experiences to, whether it's talk about serious issues or do whatever else. In any case, that was going on 20 years now, and that researcher and I still actually research and write together. He and I continue to author studies around games and play, and have done so actually all over the world, which I think is another common thread of the folks that are here. So anyways, I feel like I'm rambling, so I'll just shut myself up, but it's great to be here and excited to talk games and play and all kinds of good stuff with folks.
Great, and maybe some theory. I mean, there's
a little bit of learning theory never hurts.
That's right. We're not averse to theory here. Yeah, we're not averse to theory, but and also I'm really excited that Keegan Longwheeler could join us. Keegan and his colleague John Stewart were so instrumental to some of the stuff me and I did last year when we created our mirror world. I'll let my students say whether it was any good or not, but designing games is I mean, this is the thing I'll talk about. It's not easy, and Maha probably knows this in teaching. I don't know how you teach students to design games, so would love to hear about your experience. You're like a real gamer. I know that, Keegan.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Keegan. I'm an educational technologist at the University of Oklahoma. And kind of where I fit into all of this conversation is I actually, in my interactions with like faculty and instructors around my campus, I actually engage them in games and learning. So usually my approach recently has been game design and learning. And a lot of that like stems, it's not really necessarily about the games, but those are more the medium by which I try and get folks to think about their student engagement piece and how their course is designed, and like get them thinking in non-traditional ways about assignments they do. And like that's kind of like something that I've gravitated towards just in my work. But like Alan mentioned, I am definitely a heavy into the gaming side of things. So I was playing last night the most popular video game in the world currently because I just got the invitation on my iPad to do so. But it is the Fortnite was what I was playing last night, and that's if you don't include the game this morning of Find the Moving Box, which we were also playing this morning as we were trying to troubleshoot some computer things and do whatnot. But yeah.
Yeah, and already we have a great question in the chat. Wendy, like, can you teach playfulness? And sort of, it's a question about what happens to playfulness that I think we believe that we start with innately. We would probably say it gets suppressed in schools. I don't know. Like, what's the place of playfulness in education, guys and gals and people?
Well, that question comes from one of the reasons why I do NetNarr is to be a bit playful. Some people might know that I kept my alternative Twitter account from last year, so I'm the cow if you see a moo. And to me, one of the reasons why I kept that was to keep the playfulness. And I'm not very good at game design, and I haven't read much theory, but one of the reasons why I do this is because it's more playful than my formal studies. Yeah, I gave away the cow. That's all right. One of the reasons why I gave away the cow is because I think some people this year wouldn't know that there's a real person and they're not getting spammed. And it's still, you know, for me, I can still be playful in that space.
It's kind of fun because I still see some of our Twitter bots from last year. They're still going on and on.
So I don't want to make this already too kind of theoretically dense, but I gotta jump in here because I feel as though we've begun to possibly conflate games and play, which can intersect but don't necessarily always intersect. There are many things that people play that are not games. And there are some real important, I think, qualities of playfulness that in some ways don't exist in games. Play is often open-ended. Games are in some respects very constrained design systems. Play can be this kind of imaginative space where rules shift, notions of emergent qualities or improvisation often exist in play, which sometimes don't necessarily occur inside of games. So in any case, I'll leave it there, but I think it's interesting to think about the relationship between games and play, and when they do intersect and when they don't intersect.
That's fascinating. Anybody else want to jump in? What do you think about the overlap or non-overlap of games and playfulness? That's brilliant.
Yeah, we covered this actually in lecture early on when we were talking about, you know, what makes a game. We started with play, and the two terms that I remember are the Greek, is it, Remi, help me out here, is ludos, and then, yeah, and then of course the, I think it's Latin for play is paia or something like this, right? And the Latin term really is associated often with the child's imagination. And I think that's an interesting sort of distinction, the kind of tight constraints and rules and structure-bound world of a game in the concept of ludos versus children meeting the world and sort of making it what they will through role playing often, and a kind of imaginative engagement that comes from that other term. I thought, why is it that the latter term, the Latin term, paia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but why is that one often designated as child's play? And is there a certain point in our development where we lose that sensibility? Can we re-engage it in some ways? I was thinking about all of these things as I was thinking about the distinction between games versus play.
I was thinking as you just said this, and especially the term role play, because role play is a very structured type of play, right? And when you said about do we grow out of play, and I was thinking that maybe what happens to us as we grow older is that we start to care what other people think of us, and that this goofiness or silliness, we're not as comfortable with it. But the role play allows us to do that. And so, you know how, like, I don't know if this card game is international, it's called cheating. Do you guys know that game? So it's a game where you win by cheating. That's what you do. And it's one of those very strange games that someone who might be a very honest person in their real life can do really well in and win by cheating, but they wouldn't do that in a normal situation. And the thing about it, it's a game, but it's a very playful type of thing that you do. And it's sort of, and play allows you to be things that you can't be in your regular life. And so I think when it's to be, for example, to be playful as a teacher in a classroom, outside of any structure, takes a lot more vulnerability, and you have to be very, it's a very big risk that you take, and you make yourself very vulnerable when you do it. But when you structure it in those ways, then it sort of gives you that leeway to do it. And I try to do both. But for students to start feeling comfortable doing it back to their teacher and being goofy in front of their teacher, the structuring helps you get started, and then eventually, then you get hopefully that playful atmosphere beyond any structure, which I think is something I love having in my class when it happens.
That's interesting.
So are there games, Remi, that have no playfulness in them?
Well, I'm just writing a note to myself as I'm hearing everyone talk, and maybe we can play out some analogies here, or kind of work with some ideas, which would be that we could think of a musician who plays a score, right? We give someone who plays the piano or a violin or is in an orchestra, these are professional musicians and they play sheet music, right? There's an artifact that mediates their activity. And I'm looking at the chat now, right? We have athletes who kind of, when athletes play, they're not only playing a game, but they're often playing specific strategies or moves, right? So right now in the United States, it's March Madness. Everyone's watching college basketball. And it's not just that these college athletes are playing the game of basketball. They're playing these kind of intricate ways in which 5 people coordinate activity in response to other people coordinating activity. We've also talked about role play, right, where actors literally play roles. And so perhaps we could all name our favorite, actors and all of the roles that they've played, whether on a stage or in a film. And so as I think about those analogies, the question for me is, what do educators play? What are the things what are our scripts? What are our scores? What are our strategies? What are the things that we pick up and play if our arena, if our theater is the classroom, or in the case of what a lot of us work with, some kind of digital learning environment?
That'd be a good one to hear from some students. But interesting question, because there's a set of rules we go by and structures. And probably cheats and interesting thoughts. So students, what do you think about, is education a game itself?
I think so. I think all of academia is a game, or people are trying to put on this front of knowing what they're doing. And if you're in that teacher role, you kind of have to assume some sort of superiority over your classmates, which I think can be detrimental in some cases, because it doesn't, you can't really grow organic conversation from the students if they're afraid that they're going to say something wrong, because the teacher knows all. So I think sometimes if the teacher doesn't, I don't want to say act as the peer, but if they're on somewhat of the same level, I think that, calls for better conversations and, I don't know, discussion.
Well, that becomes a game for students, right? Students, instead of learning, they're trying to figure out what does the teacher want so that I can get the most points, the best grade out of it.
Or sometimes, like, I like when the teachers are like, yes, and like we're reading Shakespeare, and so, you know, Romeo does this, and like they're looking at you, and you're like, oh, they want me to say this, and you say that, and the teacher's like, why did you say that? I thought you wanted me to say that. You were looking right at me. I don't know. It gets confusing.
That's not fun, right? It's not fun when everybody looks at you and you didn't say the right thing. So, like, I feel like that takes away some of the play from the classroom because there's a right answer now. That's why there's less play, in my opinion.
I love it. So we had no idea we were going to talk about this, but yeah, a lot of it is like, you know, the human ability to try to project and predict futures based upon all kinds of complexities, which are, again, you know, if you get back to, like, you know, games that are programmed and designed, you know, the balance of how you can do that in a way that doesn't make the shape of the room too obvious, you know, and so, you know, how do you get that mix for the game designers between creating the structure that will give a sense of people of what to do and why, without them making feel like, oh, I know if I click this button, this is going to happen. And that's so education's a game. We've established that.
That's one of the things that we kind of delve into early when we're talking to faculty members and instructors on our campus, or, you know, what are the systems in place? What are the games that students are already playing in the classroom? Because that question kind of gets into, you know, often the grading system is brought up as like one of the main kind of pieces there within that conversation, and how that drives certain behaviors versus others, and how you could play off that, basically, how you could capitalize on some of those things to reorient or adjust the course in terms of how it's presented to students. Because often one of the things that is quite simple, but folks seem to latch onto, is the idea of taking points away from students or earning points as they go along the course itself, and that idea is a simple change, but lots of at least instructors that I've interacted with, they don't think about it in those terms necessarily. So like bringing that up and challenging some of those kinds of just base level and just accepted kinds of mentalities, I think has been really important and valuable in my interaction with folks.
One of the things that happens sometimes when my students are developing games is that they focus so much on the scoring and the winning. And I've been teaching game educational design without too much theory for quite some time, and trying to get students to play games that are cooperative, that don't go that way. We keep trying to do that. But now that we do narrative games, so that's kind of like storytelling, they usually don't have the scoring thing. But one of the things I did this last week was talk to students also about grades, and going away from this gaming the system and the grades and all that, is that I'm iterating on this approach where students don't get a grade that's a numerical thing. Talk about what does a grade mean, and they try to assess themselves like qualitatively. What does it mean to do well in this course? And what does it mean that different people have different interests and talents and they can still do well in the course? And how do we redesign the rest of the semester so that different people can do better? And I'm still iterating on how to do this one better. And it doesn't directly have anything to do with games, but I'm trying to play outside the regular game of the system that I work in, and try to still give them a letter grade in the end because I have to, but give them agency over how they earn that grade in a different way that's not what you were talking about, but not also what is traditional.
Yeah.
So maybe some thoughts from Keegan and Remi, like about like good approaches for bringing, you know, I hate the word gamification, which always sounds like a gimmick to me. but like, you know, bringing gaming principles into the teaching space, and you know, it's like any game design. It's like you don't want it to be so obvious, and you want people to be driven by something important in terms of it, not just the score.
Yeah, let me make 3 quick points. The first is that I think there's been some really interesting writing around gamification recently that's, I think, pushed back against some of the superficial pointsification that a lot of us might be more familiar with. There's been some interesting work around more meaningful approaches to gamification, and I'll dig up I believe it's an open source book that I think has some nice perspectives on the kind of edge of that work right now. I think there was a wave that kind of crashed after everybody was badging everything and leveling everything, and it kind of became too much of a fad, and there's been, I think, some interesting work since then. The second thing I'll say, which is, I'll keep it brief because it's a plug for some of my own work, is that I had the honor of being invited to write the conclusion to a book about educators as game designers. And it was a really neat project that surveyed both K-12 and higher ed faculty who were in the role of designers and were thinking about themselves as individuals who not only valued games and learning, but could actively design for gameful learning in their own teaching. And it's a really lovely book. Again, it's all Creative Commons licensed. I'll send around a link to it. But one of the points that I made in kind of synthesizing my key takeaways from this book was that there is a real kind of desire, once people develop familiarity with games, to move into that kind of designer role, which is, I guess, the last thing I like to emphasize, which is that part of developing, I think, fluency with games and play is a real kind of close emphasis around becoming a creator and a maker and a designer in this space. And I think that's really lovely. That is not always the case in other domains. Yeah, I'll tweet around the book. It's a really lovely project that a colleague put together, I guess, 2 years ago now.
It's probably pretty daunting because, I mean, you know, especially when people think about their preconceived notions of very sophisticated games and the media-rich games, and like, you know, how am I going to create a game? You know, I mean, and some people just feel overwhelmed with using media and technology, and maybe some commentary like, do you have to be an experienced gamer to teach with gaming principles?
So I want to jump in here because I actually have a lot of folks that come through some of my faculty developments and things that, like, we have some that even go so far as we do the "what's your favorite game" as like one of the first kind of talking points in discussion, because we want to pull from some of those experiences. And often we have, you know, a couple of folks in the class that are like, oh, I don't have a favorite game, because they don't identify as a gamer, right? Like, they don't have that within their identity, so they don't think about that. But then, like, sometimes it kind of evolves naturally, because some folks will be like, oh, my favorite game is like soccer or this or that, you know, this board game, or and then it kind of like opens that perspective a little bit. I think one of the things, though, that kind of gets to the point, and where I've felt a lot of success in engaging at least teachers from that side, is approaching it from like making things as accessible as possible in terms of tool set, in terms of playing to their strengths and doing some of those things. It's one of the, you know, I haven't done a session over like modifying board games, but that would be that in and of itself is an accessible way to go about some of this, because you're you know, if folks are familiar with something like Monopoly or some of these, you know, chess or checkers, like, how do you modify these games to make them better or put them in space, or whatever approach you want to take for that. But like, that would be an accessible way. The way that I choose to, that me and John work in our campus, is we do, because we can engage some auxiliary pieces like coding and storytelling, we focus in on Twine in particular, which is a free and open source tool to make narrative-based games. And the reason that one's usually an easy sell is because we attract lots of lots of English professors and lots of folks like in those spaces. We have one of the faculty that I've been doing. I'm going to go to her class in a couple weeks to do some connection with her, because she wants to bring it into some of her creative writing pieces and some of her African American study pieces and different things like that, and kind of like bring in both that storytelling and engage the students in that construction process. And that design process. But yeah, and I can talk more about if folks want to hear more about those twines and those choice-based kinds of storytelling, game design pieces. I'm happy to do that as well. But yeah, just wanted to throw those pieces out there for sure.
I just had a question, Keegan. Do you use many sort of templates? Because I know a lot of programs have templates that you can sort of pick up and go, okay, this is our suggested use of this particular program, therefore you should use it like this.
So I don't do templates necessarily, but what I do is the first day is we actually don't focus on the design. We play a whole bunch of games to start out, because I want them to know what it's like to play games, like what those games they're building will be like. So that's like the first step. But then the second step is I only introduce the bare minimum of the tools they need to build the game itself. So in Twine, there's only one syntax that I teach at the beginning, and that's it. It's if you put double brackets around words, it links passages together that create the choices, and that's all I teach to begin with, and that's all we focus on, because everything after that, I just say it's ornament, like, you know, how you go about changing the appearance and doing all these kinds of things. Everything past that core piece of syntax is if they want to tackle those things willingly.
I'm intrigued to hear. I mean, I could just ask you to talk about Twine for the rest of the time. I mean, I have some awareness of it, and you know, I'm thinking ahead to April, and so you know, I've heard various things that sometimes Twine is a lot to take on for someone new, and because of that reason, that you get wrapped up in the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, you know, but you know, it's a different kind of design process to think about how you create something with these paths, again, that just aren't obvious. You know, if I click the red door, you know, and so like how you draw people in where they lose a sense that they're just making these, you know, binary or tertiary choices out of four things. And I also say, like, I know with my students, like, they are way more expert in games than I am. And Haley knows, and Marisha knows that, like, all my game references and media references are like 4 or 5 years out of date. We make a joke out of that. But like, my students are just such a wealth of you know, they teach me more about this stuff than I'm teaching them.
I think it's important to stop and think about what it is each one of us is doing when we are asking students to design games. And I think, you know, the thing that Keegan said about teaching bare minimum is to make people concentrate on what they're really trying to do, rather than on the fancy things that they could be adding to make it even fancier, but actually what is it that you're trying to achieve with the game. So like with mine, the digital narrative games that we do, we play games that teach empathy. And I want to talk about how can you empathize with a person through a game where you give the player agency to make those choices. Of course, it's nothing compared to actually achieving empathy, but it's just sort of, can you give some sort of experience in a very short amount of time? And because that's what I want them to do, I want them to focus on the story they're trying to tell. And so I tell them you could use Google Forms and just branch out the questions, or Google Slides and just link around. Or if they want to get a little bit fancier, they can use something like Inkle Writer, which is a simpler version of Twine that's not simpler than Twine, and it's not open source. But they don't have to then create, because they don't have their own domains to be able to host something like Twine. And just focus on how the story is going to build. And if they want to add visuals, they'll add visuals, because they seem to like that a lot. But all the extras are not necessary. Yes, some of them are going to be used to like video games with the very, very, very high intensive stuff. But you can still create something really, really beautiful and focus on the content of it, if that's what the course is about. Instead of focusing on all the other things you can do to make it pretty and get distracted.
Yeah, I think, Maha, you're saying some interesting things about
the difference between a kind of aesthetic build-outs versus what in theory is often referred to as procedural rhetoric of a game. And I think I'm really fascinated by this, and I think Remi actually might be able to weigh in here a bit, but I'm really currently interested in the way in which a game opens up readership to a whole other level of reading. I mean, I of course, as a lit and writing professor, as my primary identity, I kind of think first through the lens of how do we read the world. But there's something about a game that asks us to do more than just sort of engage with the different interpretation of each word and, the kind of textual richness of the lexia, so to speak. It's interactivity, and there's navigation involved, choice. And still, in the end, there's a kind of back channel that has sort of designed your experience of that interactivity. So it's a rather complex system that you find yourself in the midst of. But back to that idea of procedural rhetoric. How do we proceed through this experience, navigate through this experience, and how does it teach us something? I'm really interested in that. And all of the games, all of the tools you've mentioned, guys, from like Twine to Ankle Writer and just the simpler things in between, really, I think, are very useful entry points for experiencing the challenge of producing something that's designed well, that has a rhetoric, a procedural rhetoric that ends up telling a good story that is profound. So I hope we can talk more about empathy, but I also wanted to ask Remi and Keegan, what they thought about the affordances that come from games that sort of bring us to a new experience of reading. Because there's something like just dealing with a representational object. That's what watching a movie is, or reading a book, etc., right? But a game is a little bit more in some way, and I'm curious about that.
Yeah, you're raising a lot of really fascinating thoughts. From a literacy's perspective, perhaps this will resonate with a lot of folks. There is this Freudian notion of reading the word and reading the world. And I think that when talking about notions of gaming literacies, a recent example that I think illustrates that in some very provocative and also some very odd ways was the global phenomenon around Pokemon Go, which I think is an interesting case of learning how to kind of read the procedural rhetorics that exist in the Pokemon Go platform, the way in which that allowed people to literally read their world in these new mediated ways through augmented reality interactions. But then in some other ways, really critically problematic ways of then actually physically engaging in the world. Pokemon Go, for all of its interesting technical affordances, was segregated by neighborhood, did a lot of harm in some respects around who could be seen playing publicly and who could not. There was this huge kind of celebration around like, let's put voter registration polls at Pokemon Go gyms, and let's like get kids playing with police officers. And it was like, wait a second, like, you've written off entire neighborhoods in most urban areas. You can't have young kids of color wandering through certain neighborhoods without fear of their own safety just because they're playing this game. And so for all of the technical kind of newness and excitement that was around this new platform, it really raised, I think, some very challenging questions around notions of safety and identity, which in some ways, if we think about all of the kind of oppressive relations that exist in real life, we can see games actually, in the procedural rhetorics of games, actually reifying those same social dynamics, even if they're attempting to be innovative and cool. Anyways, I'm going to kind of leave that critique there, but I think it kind of gets at some of the opportunities and the tensions around the rules of play, no matter how aesthetically cool it may be.
And there's something else that we've been thinking about in class a bit, and that is, of course, the common association of games, especially video games, with violence. And I know this isn't quite related exactly to what you just said, Remi, but so I'm sort of switching topics, but just free thinking in a way on to the next. But I'm fascinated by the fact that Trump recently held a summit in DC to discuss the effect that games are having and how these video games are creating monsters. That's a direct quote from a tweet he put out in 2012. But it's fascinating that he gathered together a lot of conservative policymakers to talk about the kind of harm that games are doing in youth. But of course, video games are a global phenomena, and the violence that we see in US schools is not the violence we see throughout the rest of the world. So these kind of easy lines that are drawn between games and violence in certain kind of rhetorical spheres is also fascinating to me. And I think we really need to start to think deeply about how we learn in the context of games. If a game is violent, does that necessarily mean that a person playing that game, experiencing that form of navigation, will suddenly take those behaviors into real life situations? All of these things, I think I'd like to hear what both of you guys think about the research in this particular area. But I'm quite concerned with that kind of fear mongering notion that games induce violence in specific ways, and that we can see them manifesting in the cultural sphere very easily.
Keegan, I got a lot to say about this, so
you go for it. And if I have anything, I'll jump in. So go for it.
The first thing I'll just mention is that when I did my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and for 5 years, my boss was the esteemed professor, games researcher, and all-around total badass, Constance Steinkuhler, who during my time at UW-Madison actually worked in the Obama White House in the Office of Science and Technology, specifically around games and learning. And during those same years, sadly, the Sandy Hook massacre occurred. And Constance personally briefed Vice President Biden around the issues of video games and violence when President Obama, essentially delegated to Vice President Biden the need to address gun violence. And like other politicians, they were curious about violence in video games and those relationships. And Constance basically had the vice president's ear and gave him all of the, latest, research debunking these, conflated myths and, yada, 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 which is just all to say that, and you can look up all these stories, they're all out there about those meetings that occurred in the aftermath of Sandy Hook and the way that Constance drew upon her experience in the White House to bring that work forward. And it just reminds me that the ease with which it's possible to scapegoat aspects of popular culture and to have, in our current political climate here in America, an administration that can find these kind of political footballs to punt down the road, as opposed to actually trying to tackle much harder issues like gun control, is convenient. And so games become yet another distraction from far more substantive policy issues. The research is out there, the work is out there. Amazing researchers and scholars like Constance have been doing this work for years in positions of power, and it can get ignored, in the face of political convenience. And that, to me, is very troubling.
I think one of the things that happened too, like within this whole context, is I don't know if folks saw it, but it's like a 90-second video that the White House YouTube channel put out, that all it has is violent acts in video games. It's just a montage of those, basically. And there's no context or anything other than the title itself. And it wasn't very good media usage, I'll just add as well, because videos were just captured from other YouTube channels and then remixed into this kind of propaganda kind of thing anyway. So that all aside, but like, yeah, I think one of the things that makes it kind of an easy scapegoat is that fact that they could take that 90-second video, right, and show things in 90 seconds that were flashy, that they think they could push a message with that kind of content very quickly. So I think that's one of the pieces. But the Games for Change group did a response video to that, and if you watch that one like right after, and the context between those videos, I think honestly that would be an awesome discussion piece with students, is those kinds of differences in games and how like each set of games make people feel, and how the presentation kind of plays into the whole conversation. And yeah, so yes, and I can circulate those links as well. In fact, I have them readily available, so I'll do that. But yeah.
Now you want to talk a little bit about what your students are working on, because I think that would be a nice lead-in to the kinds of things that the NetNarr students might be looking for when they look for your students' work.
Okay, but aside from the facepalm about the games, about dealing with games instead of gun control, I mean, that's just ridiculous. But not unexpected.
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
it's another horror show. Yeah.
Right. So, my students are developing games about causes that they care about, and the only thing they've had to prepare them really was that they've played several digital narrative games like Spent, which makes them experience poverty, and like there's a BBC Syrian game that makes them experience a Syrian refugees journey, and they had choices to play some other games, a lot of which are ones that actually Keegan and John Stewart have introduced me to. And then they, based on what they played, they decided what they thought a good digital narrative game would look like. And then they're doing their own. And so we have a student who's doing one about stray dogs. We have one doing one about child marriage. We have one doing about illiteracy. And they're, some of them are really taking it on. Like the one about illiteracy, for example, wants to give someone the experience of being illiterate. Now in Egypt, primary education up to secondary, up to actually K-16 is free. But we have something like 50% illiteracy, a bit higher for girls. Because people go into school and they go out and they can't read. For example, after like 5 or 6 years of school, and they still can't read. So some of them are going to try to put you in the place of that person and feel the discomfort of that person. Others are slightly more disconnected from that, but I'm hoping that they'll be able to develop good games as well. And I think with those kinds of things, when you think about it on your own, even when you research it, whether you research it by talking to people or if you research it by actually just going and see if someone else has researched it before, you don't really see how good the game is until people play it, and until lots of different people play it, and until different people play it who don't understand your context to help you clarify things in your game. And so I'm hoping that as many people as possible will give them feedback. A lot of it will come from an Egyptian context, so I think that in itself will be a learning experience for whoever plays their games, to learn about that, but also to help them make explicit what to them is implicitly understood. And so I'm going to post the link to all their games in a second on Twitter as well with the NetNarr hashtag, if anyone wants to look at it.
That's cool. And what my students will be doing this week, one of their assignments will be to each choose one of the games that Maha students are doing. And the first step of interaction is just as she's asking for, give them some feedback on their game idea, drawing from their own interest and experience and what they're thinking about games. But I'm going to do a follow-up assignment the week after, because I'm also teaching a little bit of audio editing. I'm going to ask my students to record a couple questions that they'll send to Maha students, and hopefully they'll send back some audio responses. And then I want my students to more or less make a short audio essay, putting them together as if it's a single conversation. Yeah, probably. Yeah, Flipgrid might work. We're trying to do this kind of low tech because I also want to get some media skills, but also it's a chance for students to sort of talk to each other, and it'll be a two-way street. So hopefully my students will share something they've written about games with Maha students. But a lot of it, what I'm asking them to think about this week is we're also going to follow what Maha's class did in looking at Spent and the Syrian refugee game is like, I mean, there's this really question is like, and it's not simple as like, what effect does this have on people? And does it trivialize the issue or the experience, or does it open awareness? And it's probably somewhere in between. And so some of the sensitivity that comes in designing these things, which factors back into what her students are trying to do, is like, how do you get all that into a game experience? And because all we want is some people to care more deeply and have a deeper understanding about what's going on in the world.
That's a really lovely point. And I feel like I've become a curmudgeon in my last few comments, but I've got one more kind of critique, which hopefully doesn't land too harshly, which is that, maybe it was a decade ago now, perhaps, where maybe even more, where there was this real strong emphasis on qualifying certain games as serious games because they dealt explicitly with content such as was just mentioned, access to clean water, warfare, genocide. And there were some really, I think, important critiques around the fact that checkers, for example, can be a really serious game, and that one's attitude and affect towards playing a game can be a very serious experience, particularly in certain social dynamics. So in any case, I think that there is some very gray, very kind of middle ground between games that are designed around explicit content that is controversial and yet has some type of intent around perspective taking, around awareness raising, and how do we choose to design that media and play with that media and share that media. These are all, I think, very rich questions, and there are not easy answers, perhaps, except to be like patently offensive. Like, what people should not be patently offensive. But yeah,
I think that's one of the things that really drew me into engaging instructors in game design in general, is because like the experience of thinking through those design elements is in my case, a relatively easy kind of context to like frame all of the discussion around. And whether we delve into course design or whether they're just dead set on the actual game design and the narrative design and all of those pieces, like it offers so much as a framework for so many different directions. I mean, I had a grad student make a game about the ethics in businesses, and it was like you play as you're trying to have your business be successful, but then you face really real situations where like some of your workers come and they're like, hey, I'm, one of the female workers comes and says, hey, I'm pregnant. So like what, you have to decide what your business is going to do to allow that individual to take off or not, or like all of those different kinds of things come into play. And just seeing that grad student like go through the process of translating big ideas into a medium that can be experienced by others, I think is, man, like Remi said, it's just so rich. There's so much potential there. And I think, the last thing I want to get in is like a call to action for anyone that's watching or wants to do any of this. Like, if you've never thought about building a game like this, there's no better time than now, whether you want to tackle serious things or whether you want to do more benign or whatever you want to do. Like, the tools are there to build some really interesting experiences, from storytelling pieces to just you know, modifying some card games and doing some fun. I mean, it's so fun to like engage with folks in community in these places. And I think it's been really special to do it in the higher education setting with faculty and grad students as well, because it's so fun. I just can't get away from that. It's so fun to do it this way.
Where would you point towards if someone had a hankering to try and make a game, whether in a digital space or in an analog space, or in an analog form rather, what kinds of resources and what kinds of ideas would you point towards as a kind of good foundations for tools?
So some of the things that I'll throw out there's tons of guides about modifying games and doing those kinds of things, which I think is really an easy entry point. But like I have some curriculum pieces that are published online, being as much an open practitioner as I can. I try and push that stuff to be available myself, anything that we put together. But I'd say there's lots of avenues, and I can cycle links for sure as well. But I think one of the things that really kind of captures it for me is playing games that are made by my students or just students in general, because it's easy. I think it's way easier to sell the whole game design as like kind of a learning framework when you see what learning kind of goes on within the projects itself, and whether that's the coding pieces, which actually have been really exciting for me, because I have music professors that are doing coding and they've never done it before, and they're just like, oh my gosh, I got this picture to show up by embedding it into this, into this passage in a Twine game, and they're just so ecstatic by those little kinds of pieces. So yeah. Let me cycle links, basically, all that to say.
I almost hear you saying that there's much more to be gained from the game design process as the play.
There's in the chat, there's Remi threw in something about a game jam. So I thought I asked the simple question, can you tell us about game jams and how they work, what is usually done? And I really like the idea, and I'm thinking about maybe trying to drop one down in NetNarr. So could someone expound upon that?
Do you want to go for it, Remi? I can jump in too.
I feel like this is a little bit more in your wheelhouse these days.
Okay. So a game jam to me is very much like a building a prototype in a set amount of time. Is basically what it is in a nutshell. So often these experiences have themes where you want to maybe build games that are serious games or games that are around some issue. So the idea is maybe there's a 24-hour period where you go off and it's just a design challenge. So from start to finish, build a working prototype. Now I've seen, like, depending on how large scale the game jam is, because there are some like websites and services that let you set up game jams that last like a full month, or game jams that last just like a few hours. And in some of those cases, you kind of see like very minimum viable product kinds of things, where it's like one screen of content and that's it. But then there are other instances where things are really built like within that 24 hours to be really fantastic in that amount of time. So it kind of depends, but it's the idea that you're starting from nothing, and in a 24-hour period, for instance, you try and build whatever you can within the confines of whatever the jam is. So some jams use specific tools, some have specific themes, those kinds of things. We did one on our university for some undergrad students, and it didn't it wasn't as successful, I would say, partially because we had the folks there really just came and they wanted to like play games is part of it too. They weren't as much into the designing of them, which was fine because we got to talk about, we got to engage at that first level of games and design stuff. But I can also kind of cycle a link for a few hour kind of game jam that John and I were hosting as well on our campus. But yeah.
And the last thing I'll mention, the resource that I shared, just developed by some lovely colleagues and folks who've done work in New York City for a number of years now, particularly implementing game jams in educational contexts, both of those that are happening maybe in more formal school day settings, and also those that are out of school, interest-driven, happening in museum spaces. In any case, they kind of eventually said, let's just put all of the knowledge into, again, an open source book, did so, and it's just a great resource for people who want to dip their toe into, as Keegan was just saying, setting aside time, space, often some kind of theme, some kind of maybe physical design constraints around materials or what have you, and then saying, all right, make something fun.
All right. I don't want to pull the plug on this, but we have an hour on it, but I just want to make sure that some people who maybe didn't get a chance to ask questions. And God, we got a lot of links here. Make sure I grab that. Anything from our students out there as far as game action? What's Wendy waving in?
Emergent.
Should we do a game jam?
It's funny when games get in your head, they sort of become a way of thinking. I shared a very brief story with my students the other day when my family was in Rome recently. My kids were being kids. They, from the Vatican Museum to the Borghese Museum, whatever, they're getting sick of museums, but we're walking in the streets and suddenly, like, certain kinds of pavement was hot lava and other things were portals into other worlds. And by the time we arrive at the next place, it's sort of disappointing because the things that they sort of brought in their mind to the walk were more fun than the things that they had to deal with in real life. I think that's kind of a fascinating thing. And I don't know if it's just the kids that do that, but that's a sensibility that I hope they never lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm the worst at games. I did a new DDA, digital daily thing, and I found an emulator of a classic Atari game, and like I had 0 score, so anybody can beat me in Lunar Landings. But it's still like there's something about that intrigues me is like the way people, and this is what I ask my students to talk about, is like, how do they learn a game that they don't know? Like, what is their methodology for figuring things out in the game environment, especially when it's not, the narrative games are pretty much, your choices are presented to you. But the more interesting things happen is when there are things that you don't see in the game. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we will wrap up. I want to make sure anybody else, Wave King students. All I see is the door. How you guys doing over there?
We're doing good. Yeah. Just listening. Honestly, there's so much to this. Like, it's so very far out of my wheelhouse, but it's really interesting to hear everyone's input because it's just a whole other world it's a whole other aspect of digital culture that's just, it's foreign, but it's really interesting.
And I think it's really important too.
And yeah, they're future teachers over there. I'm anticipating. So
yeah,
they get to carry it on.
Cool. Well,
thanks everyone so much for spending time with us.
Such a lovely conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you everybody for joining us. These are definitely more fun when it's a full house. I did try. I grabbed all the links from the chat and I'll put it in the webpage for the event. So I'm going to be mining them.
Excellent.
Cool. Thanks for setting this up.
This is lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Wow, bye.